When a D.C. food truck owner lost her business overnight to a new Trump security decree, Rosie O'Donnell didn't just tweet her outrage. She bought a food truck and parked it in the exact same spot. The first images that tore through the internet weren't from news cameras, but from the shaky phones of construction workers and bewildered federal employees on their lunch break. The videos were raw, crackling with the ambient noise of a city street and the sharp, distinct sound of Rosie O'Donnell's Long Island accent cutting through the air. There she was, standing on the asphalt of Pennsylvania Avenue, her arms crossed, her jaw set, arguing with two stone-faced Secret Service agents, while a bright, garishly new food truck, emblazoned with the words, "Rosie's All-American Eats," sat defiantly behind her, its generator humming, occupying the precise patch of concrete that had been declared off-limits. The clip spread not through official channels, but through group chats and neighborhood forums, a digital wildfire of shared disbelief and burgeoning excitement. In homes across the country, people leaned into their screens, watching the same 10-second clip on a loop. A celebrity, an old foil of the president, facing down federal power over a piece of sidewalk. It was an act so audacious, so theatrical, and so deeply personal that it silenced the usual political noise, replacing it with a single riveting question. What on earth was she thinking? 2 weeks earlier, that patch of concrete had a different name, Maria's Spot. For Maria Flores, the day began not with the sun, but with the gentle hiss of gas burners and the rhythmic pat-pat-pat of her hands shaping corn dough. At 4:30 a.m., in the cramped kitchen of her small suburban Maryland apartment, the world was quiet, except for the sounds of her business, El Sabor de Mama, coming to life. The air grew thick and warm, with the smells of slowly simmering carnitas, fresh cilantro, and the sweet, toasty aroma of corn arepas. By 6 a.m., she was behind the wheel of her truck, a lovingly maintained 1998 Grumman Olson that she had bought with 10 years of savings from cleaning offices. The truck was her castle, her kingdom, and her testament. The outside was painted a cheerful yellow, with a hand-painted logo of a smiling mother holding a steaming arepa, a design her son, Leo, had created in his high school art class. The inside was a gleaming testament to her meticulous nature. Every stainless steel surface polished, every container labeled, every inch of space used with an engineer's precision. Her spot, at the corner of Pennsylvania Avenue and 17th Street, was perfect. It caught the morning rush of federal contractors, the midday flood of office workers from nearby buildings, and the steady trickle of tourists navigating the path from the White House to the monuments. She had held the permit for that specific location for 12 years. She knew the Secret Service agents who walked the beat, the landscapers who tended to the nearby parks, the lawyers and lobbyists who would loosen their ties and confess they'd been dreaming of her cilantro lime sauce all morning. She wasn't just a vendor, she was a fixture, a landmark. She knew who wanted extra hot sauce, who was trying to cut back on carbs, whose daughter had just graduated. They knew her son, Leo, a lanky, bright-eyed 16-year-old who would show up after school, his backpack slung over his shoulder, to help with the afternoon rush. He'd take orders with a shy smile, his English perfect, a stark contrast to Maria's, which remained a melodic, heavily accented river of Spanish and determined English. The truck wasn't just her livelihood, it was Leo's future, the engine driving his dreams of college, of a life beyond the hiss of the griddle. On a Tuesday in late June, the end came without a sound. She arrived at her spot at the usual 6:45 a.m. to find it empty, which was normal. But as she prepared to maneuver the truck into place, she saw it. A new, metal sign bolted to the lamppost where she usually draped her string of festive lights. The sign was stark, official, and utterly impersonal. Restricted zone. Federal protective perimeter. No vending, standing, or staging. Violators subject to immediate penalty. EO 14,098. Maria stared at it, her mind refusing to connect the black letters to her yellow truck. EO 14,098? Executive order? She read it again. And a third time. She got out of the truck, her keys still in her hand, and walked to the pole. She touched the cold, smooth face of the sign. There was a smaller, laminated notice zip-tied below it, a press release from the Department of Homeland Security, citing newly assessed and credible threats, and the need to harden public-facing infrastructure. It spoke of proactive security postures and streamlined tactical zones. The words were meaningless architecture, a wall of jargon she couldn't see past. Panic began to rise in her chest, cold and sharp. This had to be a mistake, a temporary thing for a motorcade or a protest. She pulled out her phone, her hands trembling slightly, and called the D.C. Department of Consumer and Regulatory Affairs, the office that issued her precious permit. The woman on the other end was sympathetic but useless. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but that's a federal directive," she said, her voice tinny through the phone. "It supersedes any city permit. There's nothing we can do." "But for how long?" Maria asked, her voice cracking. "Is it for today? For the week?" "The order gives no end date, ma'am. It's indefinite." "I'm sorry." Indefinite. The word echoed in the empty morning air. She called a friend who ran a hot dog stand near the Lincoln Memorial. "Did you hear?" he asked, his voice grim. "They cleared out 3 spots over here, too. Something about the one big beautiful bill. More security, they said." One by one, her regulars began to arrive, coffee cups in hand, their faces etched with confusion. "Maria? What's going on? They can't do this, can they?" They looked at the sign, then at her face, and saw the answer. She stood there, a captain on a sinking ship, trying to explain the unexplainable. That afternoon, Leo found her at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of bills and invoices for food she had already bought, food that would soon spoil. He had seen the texts from her friends, the picture of the sign. He saw the defeat in his mother's posture, the way her usually strong hands were lying limp on the table. He was filled with a hot, directionless rage that only a 16-year-old can feel. He took out his phone. "Mama, come on," he said, his voice gentle. "Let's go back, just for a minute." He drove them back to the spot. The evening light cast long shadows down the avenue. He stood his mother in front of the lamppost with its stark new sign. He started recording. He didn't say anything. He just held the phone, the lens focused on his mother's face. She looked into the camera, her eyes welling up. A silent testament to a life's work, erased by a piece of metal, and a string of words she didn't understand. She wasn't performing. She was simply heartbroken. Leo panned from her face to the sign, then to the empty stretch of pavement. He posted the 45-second video to his dormant Twitter account with a simple caption. "This was my mom's business. This is what President Trump's new security looks like." He had 37 followers. He didn't expect anyone to see it. Thousands of miles away, across an ocean, Rosie O'Donnell sat in the cozy, sun-drenched living room of her new home in County Kildare, Ireland. Her post-Trump life was a deliberate construction of peace. It was green hills, cups of tea, and the blissful anonymity of being a recognizable but not quite hounded celebrity in a country that valued conversation over confrontation. Her days were spent reading, writing, and video chatting with her kids and grandkids back in the States. She tried to keep the anger that had defined so much of her public life at a low simmer, a pilot light, rather than a raging inferno. America, under a second Trump term, felt like a house she had fled but couldn't stop watching, praying it wouldn't burn to the ground. She was scrolling through a feed, half watching a video of her youngest grandchild learning to walk, when a message popped up. It was from a friend, a fellow activist in New York. "Rosie, you need to see this." There was no commentary, just a link to a tweet from an account named at LeoFlores202. She clicked. The video was shaky, the lighting poor, but the image was crystalline. A woman, her face a mask of quiet devastation, standing before a government sign that had stolen her life. The sun's silent, furious filming. It was the antithesis of a slick, produced political ad. It was devastatingly real. Rosie felt a familiar, unwelcome jolt. It wasn't just outrage. It was recognition. She saw in Maria Flores's face the same bewilderment and pain she had seen in the eyes of countless people, chewed up and spat out by indifferent systems, by bullies. The casual cruelty of it was what got to her. A woman's entire world, a business she had poured her soul into, erased with an executive order number, justified with bureaucratic gibberish about tactical zones. It was Trump's entire philosophy distilled into a single, heartless act. Big, loud power crushing something small, beautiful, and handmade. She watched the video 5 times, 10 times. She saw the pride in the hand-painted logo on the truck glimpsed at the start of the clip. She heard the unspoken love in the son's silence. This wasn't a statistic. This was a family. The pilot light roared to life. The quiet Irish countryside fell away, and she was back in the fight. Her self-imposed exile suddenly felt like a coward's retreat. What was the point of having a voice, of having resources, if you didn't use them when you saw something like this? A tweet wasn't enough. A donation wasn't enough. This required a statement, a spectacle. This required a language Donald Trump would understand. She put down her teacup. The pastoral peace of her new life shattered. She picked up her phone, bypassing her publicist and her agent. She called her business manager, a no-nonsense woman who had been with her for 20 years and was long past being surprised by her client's impulses. "Janet," Rosie said, her voice low and steady, devoid of any doubt. "I need you to do something for me. How fast can you buy me a food truck in Washington, D.C.? Janet's voice on the other end of the line was a familiar blend of sandpaper and weary affection. "A food truck," she repeated, not as a question but as a statement of fact she was trying to absorb, like a doctor looking at a bizarre X-ray. "In Washington, D.C. Let me guess, you're not planning on selling artisanal kale chips?" "Carnitas," Rosie said, her eyes still fixed on the video of Maria Flores playing on her laptop. "And arepas. The best damn arepas in the city. The kitchen has to be top of the line, Janet. Commercial grade everything. No cutting corners." There was a long pause, filled with the faint transatlantic hiss. Janet had managed Rosie's finances through talk shows, Broadway runs, public feuds, and philanthropic endeavors. She had fielded calls about adopting another child, buying an obscure art collection, and, once, chartering a plane to deliver medical supplies after a hurricane. A food truck was, by comparison, almost mundane. It was the Times location that gave her pause. "Rosie," Janet said, her voice dropping into the calm, serious tone she reserved for major decisions. "You know what this is. This isn't buying a business. This is buying a fight. A very public, very expensive fight with the most powerful and vindictive man you know. Are you ready for that? Again?" "They shut down a woman's life with a zip tie and a laminated sign," Rosie shot back, the heat rising in her voice. "They did it because she's small, because they knew she couldn't fight back. They're counting on people like her, people like us, to be too tired or too scared to make a fuss." "When did we get so tired, Janet?" Janet sighed. She knew that tone. It was the sound of a decision already made, of a moral line that had been crossed. It was the same tone Rosie had used when she decided to use her own book advance to start her foundation. For Janet, the question was no longer why, but how. "Okay," she said, the sound of her keyboard already clicking in the background. "I'll make some calls. There's a glut of used restaurant equipment on the market. Lots of businesses went under during the last round of tariffs. I can probably get a truck and have it retrofitted within a week. It'll cost you." "Good," Rosie said. "And Janet? Find the son. Leo Flores. He posted the video. He's on Twitter. Get me a number. I'm not doing this 4 times them. I'm doing this 4 times them. The next 5 days were a logistical whirlwind." From her quiet home in Ireland, Rosie became a remote operational commander. Janet, with her typical, terrifying efficiency, located a nearly new truck in a liquidation sale in Baltimore. The previous owners had dreamed of starting a gourmet grilled cheese empire, But their small business loan had been choked off by new banking regulations. Their loss was Rosie's gain. The truck was driven to a specialty shop in Virginia where a crew worked around the clock. Rosie approved the design mock-ups via email. The truck was wrapped in a vibrant, patriotic vinyl, bold red and white stripes with a field of blue stars. In a large, friendly, and slightly retro font, the name Rosie's All-American Eats was emblazoned on the side. Below it, in smaller letters, was a slogan Rosie had written herself: "Serving everyone, no exceptions." It was a direct, unambiguous statement. Meanwhile, a private investigator Janet had on retainer found Leo Flores in less than an hour. The call came to Maria's apartment on a Thursday evening. She and Leo were eating a somber meal of rice and beans, the last of her professional inventory that she couldn't bear to throw away. Leo's phone rang with an unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something made him answer. "Is this Leo Flores?" a voice asked. It was a woman. She sounded famous. Yes?" "Hi, Leo. My name is Rosie O'Donnell. Is your mother there? I'd like to speak with you both." Leo's fork clattered onto his plate. He looked at his mother, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Ma," he whispered, holding out the phone. You have to hear this." Maria took the phone with a sense of dread. Celebrities meant trouble. Attention meant trouble. All she wanted was to be left alone to figure out how she was going to pay July's rent. "Mrs. Flores?" Rosie's voice was softer now, gentler. "My name is Rosie. I saw the video Leo posted. I saw what happened to your business. I am so sorry." Maria mumbled a thank you, unsure of what else to say. "I have a proposal for you," Rosie continued, speaking slowly and clearly. "I have a long and complicated history with the man in the White House. What he did to you, he does to people all the time. He counts on us being silent. I, for one, am sick of being silent. I've just bought a new food truck, and I would like to hire you and Leo to be its first operators. I want you to cook your food, your mother's recipes, and I will pay you both double what you were making before. But there's a catch." Maria's heart pounded. "A catch? Of course. What is it?" "The truck is being prepared right now," Rosie said. "I'm flying into D.C. on Monday. On Tuesday morning, we are going to drive that truck to your old spot on Pennsylvania Avenue. We're going to park it, turn on the grill, and start serving food, for free, to anyone who wants it. We're going to make them tell us to our faces why a woman cooking food for her neighbors is a threat to national security. I won't do it without your blessing, Maria, but I am asking you to fight back with me." Maria was speechless. She looked at her son, whose face was a mixture of terror and exhilaration. She thought of the condescending voice from the city permit office. She thought of the cold, impersonal sign that had undone her life's work. She thought of the shame she felt, as if she had done something wrong. The shame was now curdling into a slow, hot anger. "You would do this?" Maria asked, her voice barely a whisper. "For us?" "I'm doing this for me too, Maria," Rosie said honestly. "But I can't do it right without you. Your food, your story, that's the heart of it. Will you help me?" Maria looked at Leo. He gave a single, emphatic nod. For the first time in a week, Maria felt a spark of something other than despair. It felt like hope. It felt like a fight. "Sigh," she said, her voice suddenly firm. "Yes, we will." Rosie's flight across the Atlantic was a journey from one life back to another. As the green patchwork of Ireland disappeared beneath the clouds, she felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She was trading her hard-won peace for the familiar chaos of a public battle. On a call with her eldest son, Parker, his worry was palpable. "Mom, are you sure about this? It's not 2007. He's not just a reality TV star anymore. He's the president. He has the entire government at his disposal. This is dangerous. What they did to that woman is dangerous," Rosie replied. Letting them get away with it, that's dangerous. I have to do this, honey. Don't worry. I know what I'm doing. But as she hung up, she wondered if she truly did. She met Maria and Leo the next day in a sterile conference room at a hotel near Dulles Airport. Away from the phone, the reality of the situation seemed to hit them all at once. Maria was smaller than she looked in the video, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Leo vibrated with nervous energy, unable to sit still. Rosie, for her part, dispensed with any celebrity pretense. She was dressed in a simple sweatshirt and jeans, her demeanor warm and direct. She laid out the new truck's registration, permits for a new mobile food business, not tied to a specific location, and employment contracts for Maria and Leo that Janet had drafted. The salaries listed made Maria's eyes water. "This is not a stunt, and it is not charity," Rosie said, looking them both in the eye. "This is a partnership. You are the heart of this. I'm just the loudmouth with the checkbook." She explained the plan for the next morning. They would arrive at 7 a.m. The authorities would show up. They would be told to leave. They would refuse. "They will threaten to arrest us," Rosie said plainly. "They might arrest me." "They will not arrest you," she said, looking pointedly at Maria and Leo. "My lawyers will be there. The second they move on you, it's over. You are protected. My only goal is to make them explain the sign. That's it. We just keep asking, why?" Maria listened, her initial fear giving way to a steely resolve. This woman was risking her freedom, her reputation, for a principle. For her. Maria reached across the table and put her hand on Rosie's. "My grandmother used to say, 'A quiet mouse gets eaten by the cat.' I have been quiet long enough." The next morning, the air was cool and thick with anticipation. The new truck, handled like a dream, its engine a low thrum compared to the familiar rattle of Maria's old one. Rosie drove, with Maria in the passenger seat and Leo in the back, surrounded by bags of fresh produce and trays of seasoned meat. As they turned onto Pennsylvania Avenue, the sky was beginning to lighten from black to a soft, hazy gray. And there it was, the corner, the lamppost, the sign. Rosie pulled the truck to a smooth stop, perfectly aligned with the curb, occupying the ghost of Maria's old spot. She put the vehicle in park and turned the key. The engine died, and a profound silence fell over the cab. For a moment, the three of them just sat there, breathing. It was the calm before the storm. "Okay, kids," Rosie said, turning to look at Maria and Leo, a determined glint in her eye. "Let's go make breakfast." She opened her door and stepped out onto the asphalt. She had taken less than 5 steps when 2 men in dark suits and earpieces materialized, seemingly out of the morning mist. They moved with an unnerving, fluid silence. "Ma'am," the taller one said, his voice polite but unyielding, "this is a restricted federal protective zone. You can't park here. You need to leave. Now." Rosie simply crossed her arms, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Morning, boys," she said, her voice carrying in the quiet street. "Funny you should say that. I seem to have misplaced my copy of the Constitution. I was hoping you could help me find the part that says you can shut down a woman's livelihood without a word of explanation. Can you point me to that article?" The taller agent, whose name tag read Donnelly, exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance with his partners. This was not the standard protocol. Protesters, they understood. Angry citizens they were trained for. A celebrity calmly and cheerfully questioning the legal basis of their orders on a Tuesday morning was a new and unwelcome development. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this isn't a debate," Agent Donnelly said, his voice a low, controlled monotone. "The directive is clear. This is a secure zone now. I need you to get back in your vehicle and move it." "And with all due respect, Donnelly," Rosie replied, her tone matching his for calm, "a directive isn't a law. It's a memo. So who's being protected here? Is it the president? 'Cause I don't see him. Is it a foreign dignitary? I don't see a motorcade. Or is it the federal government itself that's terrified of a woman making corn cakes?" As if on cue, the passenger door of the truck opened. Maria Flores stepped out, followed by Leo, who immediately raised his phone, its red recording light glowing. Maria looked at the two agents, her fear from the day before now replaced by a quiet, solid anger. She had practiced this moment in her head all night. "This was my place," she said, her voice clear and steady, the accent making her words all the more powerful. "For 12 years I am here. Every day I see you," she said, nodding at the second agent. "You buy coffee from me. Last Christmas you buy a box of empanadas for your family. You remember?" The second agent, whose name was Riggs, had the grace to look uncomfortable. He gave a slight, almost invisible nod. "So you tell me," Maria continued, taking a step forward, "my empanadas, are they a threat?" "My son, he is a threat. What changed between last week and this week to make my food so dangerous?" This was the question the agents couldn't answer. It wasn't on their briefing sheets. Their job was to enforce the line, not to justify it. The exchange was now being captured by at least a half-dozen phones. A small crowd was forming. A handful of construction workers in hard hats, a few early-rising joggers, and a woman walking her dog. One of the construction workers, a burly man with a thick beard, called out, "Hey, that's Maria! Her food's the best thing on this whole damn street!" Agent Donnelly spoke into his wrist. "Kestrel to command. We have a developing situation at checkpoint DELTA 7, Pennsylvania and 17th. We require a supervisor on site. The subject is uncooperative." While they waited, Rosie leaned against the side of her truck, looking completely at ease. She winked at Leo. "Get a good shot of them looking nervous," she murmured. 5 minutes later, a black Chevrolet Suburban pulled up. A man in a crisply tailored suit stepped out. He was older than the first two agents, with graying temples and an air of absolute, unshakable authority. This was Special Agent in Charge Mark Harris. He didn't look at Rosie or Maria. He strode directly to his men and received a hushed, rapid-fire briefing. Then he turned. "I'm Agent Harris," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth. His eyes were like chips of granite. "I'm not going to repeat what my agents have already told you. You are in violation of a federal security order. You have 5 minutes to move this vehicle. If you fail to comply, the truck will be impounded, and you," he looked directly at Rosie, "will be taken into custody for interfering with a federal operation." "That is not a request. That is a statement of fact. The clock is ticking." The air grew thick with tension. The small crowd fell silent. This was the moment of truth. Just as Rosie opened her mouth to reply, a quiet voice cut in. "That won't be necessary, Agent Harris." A man had stepped from the curb, seemingly appearing from nowhere. He was of medium height, dressed in a perfectly fitted gray suit, and held a thin leather briefcase. He moved with an unhurried, almost serene confidence. "My name is David Chen," he said, extending a business card to the agent. "I am Miss O'Donnell's legal counsel. We will not be moving the vehicle, as it is legally parked and is in the process of conducting lawful business." Agent Harris stared at the card as if it were a dead insect. "Your lawful business is taking place inside a restricted zone, counsel." "Is it?" David Chen replied, with a faint, polite smile. "According to DC Municipal Code 24-1, this entire block is zoned for commercial mobile vendings. As for your restricted zone, I'd be more than happy to advise my client to comply as soon as you can provide us with a copy of the warrant or judicial order that established it. An executive order, as you know, is a directive to federal agencies. It doesn't, by itself, grant you the authority to seize private property or suspend municipal law without due process. So if you have the warrant, we'd love to see it." The agent's jaw tightened. He knew, and the lawyer knew he knew, that there was no warrant. The zone was a unilateral creation of the Department of Homeland Security, rubber-stamped by the White House. It was designed for speed and intimidation, not for legal scrutiny. To get a warrant now would require admitting in front of a judge that the zone was created after the fact. A legal and public relations nightmare. David Chen had just called their bluff in the most polite, infuriating way possible. Agent Harris was trapped. He couldn't arrest them without risking a lawsuit that his superiors would have to answer for. He couldn't just leave them there. He glared at the lawyer, then at Rosie, and finally back to his wrist-mounted radio, his voice a low, angry hiss. "Command! Get me DHS legal on the line, now!" A stalemate. The agent stood in a loose, tense perimeter. Rosie's lawyer stood calmly by. The crowd of onlookers had now swelled to 30, then 40 people, all filming, all waiting to see what would happen next. It was into this pregnant, tense silence that Rosie clapped her hands together, the sound echoing like a starter pistol. "Well," she announced to the crowd, her voice booming with theatrical cheer. "While the grown-ups get their paperwork sorted out, some of us are hungry. What do you say, Maria? Should we make some breakfast?" Maria's face, tight with anxiety, broke into a luminous smile. This was her territory. This was what she knew. "Yes," she said, "let's cook." In a flurry of practiced motion, she and Leo unlocked and threw open the large service window on the side of the truck. Rosie reached in and fired up the main generator. It sputtered to life with a confident hum. Within moments, the pristine stainless steel interior of the truck was a hive of activity. Leo began brewing a large urn of coffee, its rich aroma the first volley in their unconventional assault. Maria, her hands moving with the grace and speed of long practice, slapped balls of corn dough onto the hot, oiled griddle. The sizzle was electric. It cut through the tension like a laugh in a library. Soon, the unmistakable, mouth-watering smell of frying onions, garlic, and seasoned pork began to waft down the street. It was a declaration of life, of normalcy, of community, in a space that had been rendered sterile and hostile by bureaucratic decree. "First ones are free," Rosie called out to the onlookers, who were now inching closer, drawn in by the smells and the sheer audacity of it all. "Come on up, don't be shy. Get yourself a cup of coffee and one of Maria's famous arepas." A young woman in a jogging suit was the first to approach, hesitantly. Leo handed her a steaming cup of coffee and a foil-wrapped arepa. She took a bite, and her eyes widened. "Oh my God," she said, "that's incredible." Her endorsement broke the dam. The crowd surged forward, forming an eager, chattering line. Construction workers, office clerks, even a few tourists who had wandered into the unfolding drama, all waited for their free breakfast. Agent Harris and his men could only stand and watch, utterly powerless, as the symbol of their federal authority, the cold, metal sign, was completely eclipsed by a spontaneous, joyous block party. They had come to enforce a line, and instead they were providing security for a free cafe, their stern faces and dark suits. A comical backdrop to the sight of people happily munching on food deemed a national threat just moments before. For nearly 2 hours, the corner of Pennsylvania and 17th Street existed in a state of surreal equilibrium. On one side of the invisible line were the federal agents, speaking in low tones into their radios, their faces impassive masks of frustration. On the other side was a thriving, impromptu festival. The line for Maria's arepas snaked down the block. Leo, now a confident field marshal, organized the queue and handed out napkins. Rosie played host, laughing with the construction workers, posing for selfies with tourists, and making sure David Chen, her lawyer, always had a hot cup of coffee. The spectacle was a poison pill for the administration. Every minute that passed was a victory for Rosie and a quiet humiliation for them. The optics were catastrophic. Heavily armed federal agents, ostensibly protecting the nation from grave threats, were effectively reduced to crowd control for a giveaway. The story was no longer about a security perimeter. It was about a feisty celebrity and a beloved local cook showing up the government with kindness and cornflour. The break came just after 9:30 a.m. Agent Harris, who had been standing rigidly by his Suburban, received a final call. His shoulders slumped, just for a second, a flicker of defeat in his otherwise stoic demeanor. He walked over to David Chen. "Your client can remain for now," Harris said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "But the vehicle must be gone by sunset. This is not a permanent arrangement. We will be reviewing the situation." He didn't look at Rosie. He simply gave a curt nod, turned, and signaled to his men. Without another word, the agents got into their vehicles and drove away. The moment the black Suburban pulled out into traffic, the crowd erupted. A wave of cheers and applause washed over the street. People honked their car horns as they drove by. The construction workers whistled and stamped their feet. It was a spontaneous, joyous roar of approval. Leo wrapped his mother in a fierce hug, lifting her off the ground as she laughed, tears streaming down her cheeks. She had her spot back, if only for a day. National news crews, who had been held back by police lines, now swarmed forward, microphones extended like offerings. Rosie, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, stood on the truck's small step, Maria and Leo on either side of her. She held up a hand for quiet. "Don't thank me," she said, her voice raspy but strong, projecting over the clicks of the cameras. "Thank this woman." She put an arm around Maria's shoulders. "Today, common sense won. Today, a little bit of decency won. This was never about me, and it was never about politics. This is about Maria Flores. It's about the hundreds of thousands of people like her, who get up at 4 in the morning to build a business, to raise a family, to feed their neighbors. They are the engine of this country, and they are tired of being treated like they're disposable. All we're asking for," she looked directly into the nearest camera, "is a little respect. We'll be back here tomorrow morning, same time, with more coffee." That evening, the adrenaline was gone, leaving behind a deep, seismic exhaustion. Back in her hotel suite, Rosie felt every one of her 63 years. Her feet ached, her back was sore, and her mind was a static buzz of noise and images from the day. She sat on the edge of the bed, the triumphant news clips playing on mute on the television across the room. She saw herself looking defiant and strong, and she felt like a fraud. In reality, she felt fragile, like a piece of china that had survived a fall but was covered in hairline cracks. Her phone rang. It was her daughter, Chelsea. "Mom!" "I saw. It was amazing. You were amazing." Chelsea's voice was a mix of pride and profound worry. "But are you okay? I've been looking online. It's..." She trailed off. "It's what, honey? Spit it out." "It's ugly," Chelsea said, her voice small. "Fox News is saying you're an agent of chaos, that you deliberately endangered national security for a publicity stunt." The comments sections. "Mom, they're posting our addresses, mine and Parker's. They're calling you a traitor. They're saying you should be in jail." Rosie closed her eyes. This was the part of the fight she had forgotten, or perhaps willfully ignored, in her peaceful Irish exile. The cost was never paid by her alone. It was always spread among the people she loved, attacks of fear and vitriol levied on them for her actions. "I'm sorry, sweetie," she said, her voice heavy. "Tell everyone to be smart. Don't engage. Just lay low. This will blow over." "Will it?" Chelsea asked, and Rosie had no honest answer to give her. After she hung up, she sat in the silent room, the weight of her daughter's fear settling upon her. She had won the day's battle, a brilliant tactical victory on a street corner. But the war, she knew, would be fought on 1,000 other fronts, many of them invisible, most of them ugly. A sharp knock on the connecting door to the next suite startled her. "Rosie, it's David. Can I come in?" Her lawyer entered, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a grim urgency. He was holding his tablet, its screen glowing. Ears. He hadn't even taken off his suit jacket. "The White House press secretary just called you a washed-up celebrity aiding and abetting lawlessness," he said, skipping any preamble. "Trump posted about you on Truth Social 3 times in the last hour. He called you a fat pig and a disgrace. That we expected." "And?" Rosie asked, bracing herself. David swiped the screen. This, we didn't. Or at least, not this fast. He handed her the tablet. It displayed a legal filing, freshly stamped by the District Court for the District of Columbia. It was a petition from the Department of Justice for an emergency restraining order, seeking to bar her from coming within 500 feet of any federal building. They're trying to legislate us off the street, David said. We can fight it, but it'll be an uphill battle in front of a judge this administration appointed. That's not the worst of it, is it? Rosie said, sensing there was more. David took a deep breath. No, Janet called me 10 minutes ago. She just received an official notification via courier. The Internal Revenue Service has initiated a Level 4 audit. That's the highest level there is. On you, personally, and on the For All Foundation, and on the holding company that technically owns the food truck. They've requested 7 years of records, personal and corporate. Correspondence, receipts, everything. Rosie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hotel's air conditioning. This was the real punch. It wasn't loud or public like the standoff that morning. It was silent, invasive, and potentially ruinous. And an IRS audit under a vindictive administration wasn't a search for truth. It was a search for a crime, any crime, they could use to destroy you. It was a war of 1,000 paper cuts. They were going to tie her up, bleed her resources, and drown her in a sea of legal paperwork. She looked from the legal filing on the screen to her own reflection in the dark television. The triumphant woman from the news was gone. In her place was a target. They hadn't been able to move her truck, so now they were trying to dismantle her life. They want to make an example of me, she said softly. Yes, David affirmed. They want to show everyone what happens when you dare to park on their lawn. The victory on Pennsylvania Avenue suddenly felt very small and very far away. The air in the hotel suite the next morning was thick with unspoken questions. The smell of fresh coffee couldn't mask the metallic taste of anxiety. Maria, her hands restlessly smoothing her apron, looked at Rosie with deep concern etched around her eyes. Rosie, maybe we stop now, she said softly, her voice heavy with the Spanish accent that came through more strongly when she was distressed. This is too much. The IRS? The government? This is not your fight. You have done enough for us. Leo stood behind his mother, his usual teenage bravado gone, replaced by a somber quiet. He nodded in agreement. Rosie was in the middle of tying her sneakers, and she paused, looking up at their worried faces. The easy camaraderie of the day before was gone, replaced by the grim reality of the stakes. She saw their fear, and she understood it. It was the rational fear of people who knew how easily a life could be ruined by forces beyond their control. Listen to me, both of you, Rosie said, standing up and putting a hand on Maria's arm. Her voice was gentle but firm. What do you think happens if we don't show up today? They win. The story becomes, celebrity pulls a stunt, gets scared, and runs away. They'll leak to the press that the audit found something, even if it hasn't started yet. They will use our silence to prove they were right. They will have successfully shown everyone in this country that if you make a noise, they will crush you. Is that the lesson we want them to teach? She looked from Maria to Leo. The only thing a bully understands is strength. The only way to fight back is to stand up again the next day. We made a promise. We're going to keep it. The drive back to Pennsylvania Avenue was a silent one. The scene that greeted them was a world away from the quiet morning of the day before. It was a circus. News vans from every major network were parked in a long, neat line, their satellite dishes pointed at the sky. The crowd was 100 strong, a roiling mix of people and signs. On their side of the street, supporters held posters that read, "I stand with Maria," and "Arepas not hate." Across the road, a smaller but louder group of counter-protesters had gathered. Their signs were professionally printed, "Law and order, support our president," and cruder personal attacks aimed at Rosie. The air crackled with a low-level hostility. a city block transformed into a microcosm of a divided nation. As Rosie parked the truck, a chorus of cheers went up from her supporters, nearly drowned out by the jeers and chants from the other side. This time, there were no Secret Service agents. Instead, a line of D.C. police stood silently, forming a human barrier between the two factions. Their presence felt less like a protection and more like a cage. As they began to set up, the pressure felt immense. Every move was being filmed, photographed, and narrated in real time. Maria's hands trembled as she lit the grill. The joy was gone. This felt like work. This felt dangerous. Just as Rosie was wondering how they could possibly sustain this, David Chen pushed his way through the crowd. His face lit with an expression she couldn't quite read. It was a mix of shock and admiration. "You are not going to believe this," he said, holding out his phone. "This just dropped on the Washington Post website." Rosie took the phone. The headline was stark. "I don't like Rosie O'Donnell, but I'll defend her right to be a pain in the neck." The byline made her do a double-take. George T. Conway 3. She quickly scanned the text. Conway, a man who represented a political world she had spent her life fighting against, did not pull his punches. He opened by stating he disagreed with O'Donnell on nearly every substantive issue. But, he wrote, that was irrelevant. The issue at hand, his column read, is not the merit of Miss O'Donnell's politics, but the weaponization of the state against a citizen exercising her First Amendment rights. The Biden administration was rightly criticized for any hint of politicizing the DOJ. The Trump administration's deployment of the IRS in this manner is a five-alarm fire for the rule of law. It is the tactic of a tin-pot dictatorship, not a constitutional republic. An audit should be a tool for compliance, not a weapon for silencing dissent. If we allow the immense power of the federal government to be used to intimidate a high-profile critic like Miss O'Donnell, what hope is there for the ordinary citizen, the Maria Flores of the world, who has no platform and no resources? This is not a left or right issue. It is an American one. Rosie felt a wave of dizziness. Conway's support was more powerful than 1,000 cheering fans. He had taken her fight, which the White House was trying to frame as a petty personal feud, and elevated it to a defense of core constitutional principles. He had given her cover, and, more importantly, a new narrative. She handed the phone back to David, a slow smile spreading across her face. The exhaustion and fear she had been carrying since the night before began to recede, replaced by a surge of pure, defiant energy. She knew exactly what she had to do. She grabbed a portable microphone her team had brought, just in case. She didn't step out into the scrum of reporters. She simply stood on the step of her truck, the service window her podium, Maria and Leo, her silent honor guard. "Good morning, everyone," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. The chanting from across the street faltered as even her opponents turned to listen. "Last night," she began, "the United States government, in response to us giving out free coffee, decided to sue me and launch a massive IRS audit into my life, my family, and my foundation. Their message was very clear. Sit down and shut up." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But I was reading a column this morning by a conservative lawyer named George Conway, someone I probably wouldn't agree with on the time of day." A ripple of laughter went through her supporters. "And he reminded me of something important. This isn't about me being a liberal. It's not about President Trump being a Republican. This is about the abuse of power. It's about the government deciding it can use its most powerful agencies to bully and silence any citizen it doesn't like." She held up her phone, displaying the article. "This is not a left-wing issue. This is an American issue." The crowd on her side of the street roared its approval. "So I want to announce something," Rosie continued, her voice ringing with passion. "The White House wanted to make an example of me. Fine. Let's be an example. My foundation, For All, is today launching a new legal defense fund. We're calling it the Food Truck Fund." A wave of murmurs went through the crowd. This fund will provide legal and financial support to any small business owner, any artist, any independent journalist, any citizen. I don't care about their politics, their religion, or who they voted for, who is facing intimidation or unjust prosecution from any government agency. If they come for you, we will be there for you. She looked straight into the lens of the nearest network camera. And to get things started, I am making the first donation myself. $1 million. The crowd gasped. The reporter scribbled furiously. You wanted to audit me? Rosie said, her voice dropping, now speaking directly to the camera, to the man in the White House. You wanted to make an example of me? Congratulations. You did. You have shown the entire country what you are willing to do to hold on to power. And I am showing them what we are willing to do to stop you. And this is what happens when you try to silence one of us. All of us show up. She put the microphone down. The silence that followed was broken by a single, thunderous wave of applause from her supporters. She turned her back on the cameras, on the cheering, on the furious faces across the street. She looked at Maria, whose face was a beautiful, complicated picture of shock, gratitude, and pride. Rosie simply smiled, picked up a spatula, and leaned towards the grill. Now, she said, her voice once again the cheerful host. Who wants an arepa? Rosie's $1 million gambit landed like a thunderclap. In the hyper-polarized landscape of 2025 America, it was an event so unusual it broke the normal circuits of outrage and praise. It wasn't just another celebrity writing a check. It was a targeted, weaponized act of philanthropy, broadcast live from the very battlefield an opponent had chosen. Within an hour, the food truck fund was the #1 trending topic in the world. The news coverage was chaotic and contradictory. On MSNBC, hosts hailed it as a masterstroke of political jujitsu, a moment that transcended the left-right paradigm. On CNN, legal analysts debated the sheer audacity of the strategy, questioning its long-term viability while marveling at its short-term brilliance. On Fox News, the narrative was furious and defensive. The fund was a dark money slush fund. Rosie was laundering her reputation, and the entire spectacle was an insurrectionist plot to destabilize the presidency. But their outrage couldn't conceal a frantic undertone. Rosie had changed the game, and they were scrambling to rewrite the rules. The most powerful story, however, wasn't on television. It was on the fund's hastily erected website, which David's firm had prepared as a contingency. It was a simple, elegant site featuring a high-resolution photo of Maria smiling proudly in front of the truck. Below it was a short mission statement and 2 links: donate and share your story. The site was designed to handle a surge, but it was nearly overwhelmed. The donate button became a flickering beacon, processing a relentless stream of small contributions. $5 from a nurse in Omaha. $20 from a retired teacher in Florida. $10 from a college student in California. It was a digital barn raising, a grassroots affirmation that the story had struck a deep and resonant chord. But it was the Share Your Story portal that revealed the true scope of the problem Rosie had tapped into. The submissions began as a trickle, then became a flood. They were raw, desperate, and came from every corner of the country, painting a grim mosaic of quiet intimidation. A message arrived from a man named Frank Ryder in Billings, Montana. He attached a photo of himself on horseback, a sprawling, empty landscape behind him. He was a third-generation cattle rancher, a lifelong Republican who had voted for Trump twice. His family had held grazing permits on adjacent Bureau of Land Management territory for 70 years. 3 months ago, after he co-signed a letter to the editor in the Billings Gazette criticizing the Interior Department's new water usage regulations, his permits were put under an emergency review for environmental noncompliance. His cattle were barred from the land, effectively cutting his operational size in half. He was facing bankruptcy. I thought this was America, he wrote, his message typed in all caps. I didn't know WHO to turn to. I saw you on the news. I don't agree with your politics, ma'am, but God bless you. Another email came from a woman named Susan Lynn Ashby in a small town in North Carolina. She owned a bookstore called The Next Chapter. She had been a beloved local figure for 20 years until she hosted a drag queen story hour. A local pro-Trump activist group organized protests. A week later, she was visited by the county zoning inspector for the first time in a decade, who found a dozen critical violations, including improper ramp grading and insufficient fire extinguisher signage. She was now facing daily fines and the potential revocation of her business license. "They're trying to bleed me dry," she wrote. "They want my shop. They want me gone." And on it went. A high school science teacher in suburban Houston, fired after a politically connected parent complained he was indoctrinating students with climate alarmism for teaching the state-approved curriculum. A freelance photojournalist in Oregon who had his press credentials revoked by the U.S. Forest Service after documenting a controversial logging operation. Each story was unique, yet they all shared a common, terrifying thread: the use of bureaucratic power as a blunt instrument to enforce silence. Inside the White House, the mood was sour. An agitated press secretary, fielding frantic questions from his team, threw his hands up in the air. "How do we spin this?" he fumed. "We sent the IRS after a talk show host, and in 24 hours she's become Mother Teresa for ranchers and librarians. We can't attack a fund that's helping a guy who probably has a Trump flag on his porch. We look like bullies. He looks like a bully." The attempt to isolate and crush Rosie had backfired spectacularly. She had absorbed their attack and reflected it back, illuminating 1,000 other fires they had quietly set across the country. That evening, long after the crowds had dispersed, Rosie, Maria, and Leo sat in the hotel suite, which now felt less like a sanctuary and more like a campaign headquarters. A stack of takeout boxes sat on the table, mostly untouched. David Chen was on a conference call with a team of lawyers he was assembling. Maria was scrolling through the stories that the fund's new volunteer screeners were flagging for her. She looked up from the tablet, her eyes filled with a profound sadness. "They are all me," she said quietly. "This man in Montana, this woman with the books. They work hard. They follow the rules." And then one day, a man with a piece of paper comes and says, "You are finished." It is the same story. Rosie saw the shift in her. Maria's fear had been personal, centered on her own survival. Now she saw herself as part of a vast, invisible community of the targeted. Her perspective had zoomed out, and with it, her purpose was crystallizing. "The media requests are piling up," Rosie said gently. "Everyone wants to talk to you, Maria, to both of you." She looked at Leo, who was listening intently. "This has become bigger than any of us could have imagined. You didn't sign up for this. If you want to step back, I understand. We can hire a spokesperson. You and Leo can manage the business, the food, away from the cameras. No one would blame you." Leo spoke before his mother could. "No," he said, his voice firm with a newfound conviction that made him seem older than 16. "We can't stop. They want to talk to us? I'll talk. I'll tell them what they did to my mom, what they're doing to that rancher." Maria looked at her son, and her expression of sadness softened into one of fierce pride. She turned to Rosie. "My whole life I try to be small. Don't make trouble. Be invisible. But I see now, being invisible is not safe. If they want to hear my story, I will tell it. Maybe it will help the woman with the bookstore." The battle lines were now clear. The daily protest at the food truck on Pennsylvania Avenue would continue, but its function had changed. It was no longer just a protest. It was a pilgrimage site, a media hub, and a symbol of a movement that was growing by the hour. In the background, the silent, grinding war of the restraining order and the IRS audit would continue, a constant, looming threat. But Rosie was no longer fighting alone. She was now the de facto general of an army she hadn't known existed 24 hours earlier. An army of ordinary Americans who had simply had enough. The week following Rosie's announcement was one of controlled chaos. The hotel suite was transformed into a bustling nerve center. Young, idealistic volunteers filtered through, laptops under their arms, organizing spreadsheets of donations, and categorizing the heart-wrenching stories pouring into the fund's inbox. David Chen, recognizing he was now the general counsel for a burgeoning national movement, moved quickly to build his army. He made 3 calls. The first was to an old law school rival, Anita Desai, a legendary ACLU litigator with a fiery reputation and a photographic memory for precedent. The second was to Marcus Thorne, a former U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York who had resigned in protest during Trump's first term and now worked in private practice. Marcus brought prosecutorial discipline and an insider's understanding of the Justice Department's pressure points. The third was to a brilliant young constitutional law professor from Georgetown named Ben Carter, whose blog on executive overreach was required reading inside the Beltway. They all agreed to work pro bono, clearing their schedules for what they all recognized as a landmark fight. Their first strategic meeting was a video conference with Rosie, David, and the new legal team. "The White House wants to paint this as a coastal elite liberal crusade," Marcus said, his voice a calm baritone. "Our first client has to demolish that narrative. It has to be someone they can't possibly caricature." Ben Carter pulled up a file on the shared screen. It was Frank Ryder, the Montana rancher. "He's perfect," Ben said. "Registered Republican. Voted for Trump in 16 and 20. His family has worked that land since the Eisenhower administration. The BLM's case against him is transparently retaliatory. If we champion him, we're not just defending one man, we're defending an American archetype." The decision was unanimous. That afternoon, Rosie sat down for a video call with Frank. On the screen, he was exactly as he appeared in his photo, craggy, sun-beaten, and deeply uncomfortable. He wore a faded denim shirt and sat in a cluttered office, a pair of dusty cowboy hats hanging on the wall behind him. "Mr. Ryder," Rosie began, her voice warm and direct. "I'm Rosie O'Donnell. Thank you for trusting us with your story." Frank grunted. "My wife, she made me do this. I don't take charity." "This isn't charity, Frank," Rosie said gently. "It's solidarity. I've read about your case. They're trying to ruin you because you spoke your mind. Does that sound right to you?" "Nothing sounds right anymore," he muttered, looking down at his hands. "My father and his father worked this land. We watch over it. We care for it. Then some kid from Washington in a shiny truck tells me I'm a menace to the environment and takes away half my grazing land. It's a lie. It's all a lie." "I know," Rosie said. "So here's what we're going to do. Our lawyers are the best in the business. They're going to file a lawsuit on your behalf against the Department of the Interior, seeking an immediate injunction to restore your permits. We'll cover every cent of the cost. All you have to do is keep telling the truth. Can you do that?" Frank looked up, his pale blue eyes meeting hers through the screen for the first time. He saw no pity in her face, only a shared, steely resolve. "Yeah," he said, a hint of his old grit returning. "I reckon I can do that." While the legal gears began to turn, Maria Flores prepared for her own battle. She had agreed to a sit-down interview with Anderson Cooper. She refused a stylist or media coach, choosing to wear a simple blue dress she'd bought at Kohl's for church. She sat across from the famous news anchor, the studio lights hot on her face, and simply told her story. She didn't speak about the president or politics. She spoke about the feel of the dough in her hands at 4 a.m. She described the precise, comforting smell of the carnitas simmering with oranges and Mexican Coke. She talked about Leo's pride when he designed the logo for her first truck, and the way her heart swelled when a regular told her that her arepas were the only thing that tasted like home. When Cooper asked her what she felt when she saw the government sign that had shut her down, she didn't use words like angry or unjust. "I was confused," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I thought, what did I do wrong? For 2 days I check everything in my head. My permits? All paid. My taxes? All paid. My kitchen? So clean the inspector calls it a church. I did everything right, so I thought it must be me. Maybe I am not welcome here anymore." Her quiet dignity was devastating. It was a testimony so profoundly human that it sliced through all the political spin. The interview went viral, and in the days that followed, donations to the food truck fund quadrupled. The administration, however, was not idle. Their countermove came in the sterile, air-conditioned quiet of a federal courtroom. The hearing for the restraining order was presided over by Judge Lawrence McTeague, a 70-year-old Trump appointee with a reputation for being impatient with what he considered legal theatrics. The DOJ lawyer, a prim, severe man, argued that the food truck represented a grave and ongoing security risk, creating a flashpoint for civil unrest and an unpredictable variable in a high-threat area. Anita Desai, arguing for Rosie, was merciless. "Your Honor, the government has presented zero evidence of any specific threat. They speak of flashpoints. The only flashpoint here is the one they created when they unjustly revoked Ms. Flores's permit. This is a textbook case of prior restraint on speech. They are not trying to secure Pennsylvania Avenue. They are trying to silence Ms. O'Donnell." Judge McTeague listened, his face an unreadable slate. He issued his ruling from the bench an hour later. "The government's request for a 500-foot blanket restraining order is denied," he said, and a brief murmur of relief went through Rosie's team. "It is overly broad and not sufficiently justified." But then he continued, "However, the court does recognize the government's legitimate interest in maintaining order and regulating commercial activity in this sensitive district. Therefore, a narrower injunction is granted. The vehicle in question," he said, peering over his glasses, "may not remain stationary for more than the standard 3-hour limit for a commercial vehicle. Furthermore, the active service of food from the vehicle is hereby prohibited, pending a full review by the D.C. Department of Health and the Secret Service to establish new safety protocols." David Chen's face went pale. He leaned over and whispered to Rosie, "He gutted us. He dressed it up as a reasonable compromise, but he gutted us." The judge had been clever. He hadn't banned their protest, but he had surgically removed its heart. They could still park the truck for 3 hours at a time. They could still stand on the sidewalk. But they could no longer operate as a food truck. They couldn't cook. They couldn't serve. He had taken away the sizzle of the griddle, the smell of the coffee, the act of communion over a shared meal. He had taken Maria's power away and turned their vibrant, living symbol back into a static prop. That evening, the mood in the hotel suite was funereal. The triumphant energy from Maria's interview and the Montana lawsuit was gone, replaced by a cold dread. They had been outmaneuvered. "So what now?" Leo asked, his voice cracking with frustration. "We just park the truck there and stand around looking sad?" "It's exactly what they want," Rosie said, pacing the room. "They want to turn our party into a picket line. They want to make us look like any other boring protest. They took the joy out of it. They had scored a major victory in the court of public opinion, but they had just suffered a crippling defeat on the legal battlefield that mattered most. A food truck, the very symbol of their rebellion, had just been put on a leash. The atmosphere in the hotel suite was thick with the bitter taste of defeat. Anita Desai, the ACLU firebrand, paced the floor like a caged panther. "It's a complete sham," she seethed. McTeague used public health as a pretext to shred the First Amendment. "It's a content-based restriction disguised as a time, place, and manner regulation. We can appeal, but it will take months." Marcus Thorne, ever the pragmatist, shook his head. "By the time we get a hearing, the momentum will be gone. The news cycle will have moved on. They don't need to win on the merits. They just need to win the clock." It was Rosie who broke the funereal mood. She had been sitting quietly, watching her team of legal geniuses dissect the ruling. "You're all thinking like lawyers," she said, her voice cutting through the jargon. "You're trying to win an argument in their building, by their rules. We didn't win last week by having a better legal argument. We won because we threw a better party." They all looked at her, confused. "Read the ruling again," Rosie insisted. "What, exactly, did he ban? He banned us from staying more than 3 hours. Fine, we'll come in shifts. He banned us from serving food from the truck. He didn't ban us. He didn't ban the truck. He didn't ban us from giving away food. We're so focused on the one thing he took away that we're not seeing all the things he left us. Leo, who had been sitting on the floor, scrolling through glum comments on social media, looked up. An idea was flickering in his mind, born from 1,000 pizza nights with his friends. "So what if the food doesn't come from the truck?" he asked hesitantly. "What if the truck is just the meeting place? Like, the food is just there?" Rosie's eyes lit up. She pointed at Leo. That's it! The kid's a genius!" She started pacing, her energy transforming the room's atmosphere from a wake to a war council. "We've been thinking of the truck as a kitchen. That's over. From now on, the truck is a billboard. It's our symbol. The protest doesn't happen in the truck. It happens in front of it." The new plan, which they christened Maria's Table, came together quickly. It was simple, elegant, and legally defiant. They would obey the letter of the judge's ruling, while creatively violating its spirit. Rosie's truck would park for its allotted 3 hours, but in front of it, on the public sidewalk, they would set up a long folding table, covered with a simple, welcoming tablecloth. And on that table, they would place food. The masterstroke was the sourcing. The food truck fund, flush with new donations, would not just feed the crowd. It would use its resources to create an alliance. Each day, they would contract with a different DC area food truck or small restaurant, many of whom were struggling with the city's sluggish economy, to provide the day's catering. The strategy was a stunning piece of political jiu-jitsu. It complied with the court order, as no food was served from Rosie's vehicle. It transformed the protest into a daily act of economic stimulus for the very community they were championing. And it made the administration's position even more untenable. To stop them now, they would have to argue that American citizens could not legally give away free food purchased from another licensed vendor on a public sidewalk. The first day of the new strategy felt like a quiet revolution. Rosie parked the truck at 9 a.m. The crowd was smaller, more subdued, expecting a diminished protest. The counter-protesters across the street jeered, holding signs that read, "Trucks closed," and "Game over." Then, Maria and Leo emerged from a minivan and began setting up a long folding table. A moment later, a second food truck, this one painted with the vibrant logo of Ahmed's Falafel, pulled up and parked in a loading zone down the street. A smiling, middle-aged man, Ahmed Al-Jamil, a refugee who had fled Damascus 7 years ago, began carrying out insulated containers filled with fragrant falafel, hummus, and pita bread. He placed them on Maria's table. The crowd watched, first in confusion, then in dawning comprehension. Rosie stepped up to her microphone, a broad smile on her face. "Good morning," she said. "A judge told us we weren't allowed to cook for you in our truck, so we're obeying his order. But he never said we couldn't set a table for our friends, and he certainly didn't say we couldn't support other great local businesses while we're at it." She gestured to Ahmed, who beamed and waved. "Today's meal is courtesy of my friend Ahmed, who makes the best falafel in the district. Come on up, the food is great, and the conversation is free." A huge cheer erupted. The move was so unexpected, so joyfully defiant, that it completely reinvigorated the protest. People lined up, not just for the food, but to shake Ahmed's hand, to thank Maria, to be a part of this new, clever act of resistance. The White House had wanted to shut down one food truck. Rosie, in response, had started a festival that celebrated dozens. While the public battle evolved, the private war of attrition continued. The IRS audit intensified, becoming a form of bureaucratic harassment. Janet, Rosie's business manager, now had 2 full-time accountants dedicated solely to responding to the endless, granular requests. They wanted receipts for office lunches from 2018. They wanted justification for the travel expenses for a guest on Rosie's old talk show. They wanted the minutes of every board meeting of the For All Foundation. It was a slow, expensive, and psychologically draining siege, designed to exhaust and distract. They're not looking for a crime, they're looking for a typo, Janet told Rosie grimly over the phone. "They're hoping we miss a deadline or misfile a form so they can slap us with penalties and leak a story about financial misconduct." But for every dispiriting notice from the IRS, there was a spark of hope from the fund. Late one afternoon, Rosie, David, and Marcus Thorne were on a conference call with Frank Ryder. The rancher's face, usually a mask of stoicism, looked different. He was sitting in front of a stack of papers, but for the first time, he seemed to understand them. Marcus had been walking him through the lawsuit they had filed on his behalf. "Frank, their entire case rests on an emergency review," Marcus explained, his voice patient and clear. "We filed a motion of discovery to force them to produce the data that prompted this so-called emergency. They don't have it. We know they don't have it. They're going to have to admit in front of a judge that the review was initiated the day after your letter was published. We're going to corner them." Frank was silent for a long moment. He adjusted his glasses and looked out a window, presumably at the vast Montana landscape he was fighting for. "All these months," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was alone. I thought I was going crazy. You read these government papers, and the words, they don't make sense. It's like they're speaking another language. But you speak it. You're fighting them back with their own words." He turned back to the camera. "Thank you," he said simply. "For the first time in a year, I feel like I might just get my land back." When the call ended, Rosie leaned back in her chair. The victory on the sidewalk felt good, but this, the quiet, emerging hope in a good man's voice 1,000 miles away, felt like winning. The success of Maria's table was a source of constant, grating irritation for the White House. Every morning, a new story bloomed from the corner of Pennsylvania and 17th. One day, it was about a family-run Ethiopian catering business saved from the brink by a contract from the fund. The next, it was about a Korean taco truck owner, a U.S. Army veteran, who tearfully talked about what it meant to see the community rally around him. The protest was no longer about Rosie O'Donnell versus Donald Trump. It was a daily celebration of diversity, resilience, and commerce. Everything the administration's nativist rhetoric sought to undermine. The narrative was lost. The legal and bureaucratic attacks had been parried with infuriating creativity. Reports from inside the West Wing described a president volcanically angry at the daily images of his chief antagonist looking like a beloved neighborhood matriarch. The order that trickled down through informal channels was simple and crude. End it. The shift on the ground was palpable. The crowd of counter-protesters across the street began to change. The usual mix of angry citizens was slowly supplemented by a harder element. Men with military-style haircuts and matching polos, who moved with an unnerving coordination. Their chants grew more pointed, more personal, more menacing. They held up high-resolution photos of Rosie's children, their faces circled in red. The goal was no longer to win an argument, but to create an atmosphere of pure intimidation. The breaking point came on a bright Thursday afternoon. A young family from Ohio, clearly tourists, had wandered over, drawn in by the smell of the day's offering. Barbecue from a cherished D.C. soul food kitchen. As the mother and her 2 small children stood in line, a group of the new, more aggressive protesters advanced to the police barricade, aiming their venom directly at them. "Look at you," a man with a bullhorn screamed, his face contorted with rage. "Eating with traitors, teaching your kids to hate America. You're disgusting." The mother flinched as if struck. She grabbed her children's hands, her face pale with fear, and quickly pulled them away from the line, retreating down the street. The protesters cheered, victorious. They had drawn blood. Maria gasped, putting a hand over her mouth. Leo, his face flushed with anger, took a step forward. "Hey! Leave them alone!" he shouted. Rosie put a firm hand on his shoulder. "Don't, Leo," she said, her voice a low command. "That's what they want. They want to fight. They want an excuse to shut us down." But Rosie knew she couldn't let it stand. The entire point of Maria's table was to create a space of welcome and safety. That space had just been violated. She watched as another family hesitated, then turned away, scared off by the vitriol. This was how they would win. Not with court orders, but with raw fear, with a calm that no one on her team felt. Rosie handed her apron to one of the volunteers. She walked to the edge of the curb, took a deep breath, and then did the one thing no one expected. She crossed the street, alone. She walked through the gap in the police barricades, her expression unreadable. The officers tensed, ready for a flashpoint. The crowd of her supporters fell silent, watching with a mixture of terror and awe as she entered the hostile territory of the counter-protest. The jeers intensified, a wall of sound crashing over her. She ignored the signs and the screaming faces, her eyes scanning for the man with the bullhorn who had accosted the family. He was a big man, thick-necked and red-faced, in the middle of a rant about communists and globalists. Rosie walked directly up to him and stopped, standing a few feet away. She didn't speak. She just waited, her hands loose at her sides, her gaze steady. The man faltered, his diatribe cut short by her silent, direct presence. He lowered the bullhorn. "What do you want?" he spat, his voice suddenly smaller without the electronic amplification. The people immediately around them quieted down, craning their necks to see what would happen. This was more interesting than chanting. "What's your name?" Rosie asked, her voice calm and so quiet it was almost a whisper. The question disarmed him. "What?" "Your name," Rosie repeated. "What is it?" "It's Paul," he stammered, thrown off balance. "Okay, Paul," Rosie said, taking a small step closer. Her voice remained low, forcing him and those nearby to lean in. "That woman you just screamed at? The one with the 2 little kids? She could be your sister. She could be your neighbor. She's just a mom from Ohio trying to get her kids some lunch." "Tell me, Paul, what about that makes you so angry?" Paul was flustered. He was prepared for a shouting match, not an intimate conversation. "She's with you! You hate this country! You hate the president!" "I don't hate this country, Paul. I love it," Rosie said, her voice still impossibly calm. "I love it so much that I think a woman like Maria should be able to run her business without being crushed by the government. I think a rancher in Montana should be able to speak his mind without losing his land. And I think a mom from Ohio should be able to stand in a line for a free meal without being terrorized. Don't you?" She wasn't arguing with him. She was simply asking questions, holding up a mirror to his own rage. He had no answer. He just sputtered, his face turning an even deeper shade of red. The mob around him was silent, confused. The script had been flipped. Their leader was being quietly and politely dismantled. The moment was broken by the police, sensing they were losing control in a different way. 2 officers stepped in, gently but firmly putting themselves between Rosie and Paul. "Okay, ma'am, let's go back to your side of the street," one of them said to Rosie. To Paul, the other officer said, "Take a break, buddy. Cool off." They were de-escalating, but the visual was clear. They were shielding Rosie from the angry mob. Rosie gave a small nod and walked back across the street. As she reached her own side, her supporters, who had watched the entire exchange in breathless silence, erupted in a wave of applause that was deeper and more heartfelt than any before. She had faced down the mob, not with anger, but with a radical act of grace. The victory, however, was fleeting. She was shaken, the adrenaline leaving a tremor in her hands. She had won the moment, but the incident was a clear sign that the administration and its allies were done with subtlety. Her fear was confirmed late that night. David Chen arrived at the hotel, his face pale, his usual professional composure gone. He was holding a single piece of paper. "It's from a source I have inside the DOJ, David said, his voice barely audible. "A friend. He's risking his career to tell me this." He handed the paper to Rosie. It wasn't a court filing. It was a memo, a copy of a recommendation being forwarded to the Attorney General. "They're convening a federal grand jury," David said, his voice grim. "They're moving past the injunction. They're dropping the IRS audit as the main line of attack because it's generating too much sympathy." Rosie scanned the memo, her heart growing cold. "What's the charge?" "It's not a charge yet. It's what they're investigating," David said, looking her directly in the eye. "They're pursuing an indictment under 18 U.S. Code Section 2384. Rosie didn't know the number. "Which is seditious conspiracy," David said, the words landing like stones in the silent room. "They're going to argue that the food truck fund is a front, that you are conspiring with others to use force to prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of a law of the United States. Specifically, the executive order that created the restricted zone. They're going to say your goal is to overthrow the government's authority. They're not trying to fine you anymore, Rosie. They're going to try to put you in prison for 20 years. The news of a potential seditious conspiracy charge landed not with a thud, but with a shattering crack that split the political landscape. Rosie's team, working with a trusted reporter from the Associated Press, leaked the DOJ memo. The story, published just before midnight, was stark, factual, and explosive. The federal government was considering charging a citizen with a crime punishable by 20 years in prison for organizing a charity that gave away free food. The reaction was immediate and visceral. This was an escalation so extreme, so wildly disproportionate, that it broke through the calcified layers of partisan loyalty. For weeks the debate had been about protests, permits, and politics. Now it was about a bedrock American principle: fairness. The image of the government threatening a woman with decades in prison for serving falafel on a sidewalk was, for many, a clarifying moment. The first crack in the administration's wall of support appeared, as it often does, on a Sunday morning talk show. Senator Miles Grayson of Utah, a traditional conservative and a quiet but influential voice in the Republican caucus, was asked about the investigation. "Our political disagreements have become too toxic," Grayson said, his face grim. "But there have to be lines. Using sedition laws designed to prosecute armed insurrection, against a political critic engaged in civil disobedience is a profound abuse of power. The Department of Justice serves the American people, not the political whims of any president. This investigation must end." His words opened the floodgates. One by one, other mainstream conservatives, who had held their noses through Trump's second term, began to speak out. George T. Conway III and a coalition of anti-Trump conservative lawyers filed a scathing amicus brief, not only defending Rosie, but calling for a formal inquiry into the Attorney General for prosecutorial misconduct. They argued the investigation itself was a criminal violation of Rosie's civil rights. The public response was a tidal wave. The crowd at Maria's table swelled from hundreds to thousands. It was no longer just a protest. It was a pilgrimage. Frank Ryder, the Montana rancher, flew in on his own dime, standing silently in the crowd in his cowboy hat. Susan Lynn Ashby closed her North Carolina bookstore for 2 days and drove to D.C., holding a simple, hand-painted sign that read, "Reading is not a crime, neither is cooking." They stood alongside union workers, tech entrepreneurs, suburban mothers, and college students. The coalition the Food Truck Fund had built online now manifested in the real world, a silent, powerful rebuke to the government that stood just blocks away. Faced with a rebellion in his own party and a PR catastrophe that had united the ACLU with cowboys, the Attorney General found himself isolated. The pressure was immense. Less than 72 hours after the story broke, his office released a terse, 2-sentence statement. "After a thorough review of the preliminary evidence, the Department of Justice has concluded its inquiry. No charges will be filed." It was a full-scale, humiliating retreat. That same afternoon, bowing to pressure from a suddenly defiant city council, the DAC government announced a re-evaluation of the Pennsylvania Avenue security perimeter. Several designated commercial vending spots were restored. The first one listed was the corner of 17th Street. Maria Flores had her spot back. 1 month later, the Washington, D.C. air was crisp with the first hints of autumn. The news crews were long gone, chasing the next political firestorm. The corner of Pennsylvania and 17th was bustling, but it was the normal, cheerful bustle of a city lunch hour. The bright, patriotic vinyl of Rosie's All-American Eats was gone. In its place, parked in its rightful spot, was a familiar yellow truck. A new, professionally painted sign graced its side. El Sabor de Mama. Rosie O'Donnell sat at a small cafe table on the sidewalk, sipping a coffee. She was no longer the center of attention, and she looked perfectly content. At the service window of the truck, Maria laughed, handing a bag of empanadas to a customer. Her business was thriving, with a new legion of loyal fans. Inside, Leo, who had deferred his first semester of college to help his mother relaunch the business, worked the register with the easy confidence of a young CEO. On the tablet in front of Rosie, a video conference was in session. It was the first quarterly update for the board of the food truck fund. Frank Ryder's face was on the screen, live from his ranch. "The judge threw out the BLM's review last week," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Got my permits back. The land is safe." Susan Lynn Ashby's face popped up next. The city council dropped all the zoning violations after they got the letter from our lawyers, she announced. "We're having a special story hour this weekend to celebrate." One by one, a dozen other faces. A teacher reinstated, a journalist's credentials restored, a small business saved from harassment, shared their stories. Each was a small but profound victory, a quiet echo of the noisy battle that had been won. Rosie didn't say much. She just listened. A deep, quiet satisfaction settling in her heart. She had come back to America to fight one injustice, and had ended up building a self-sustaining engine for fairness, a shield for the voiceless. Leo came over from the truck, holding a plate. On it was a single, perfect arepa, steaming in the cool air. He set it down in front of her. "On the house," he said with a grin, no longer the shy boy from the video, but a confident young man who had seen the world change up close. "Thanks, Leo," Rosie said. She picked up the arepa. It was warm in her hands. It tasted of corn and cilantro and hard work. It tasted like coming home. What does it truly mean to stand up to power? Is it about winning a single, public fight, or building something that helps others win theirs long after you're gone? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. For more stories about unlikely heroes and the courage to make a difference, don't forget to subscribe.